So thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to MORPC's 2020 Summit on Sustainability, Social Equity Panel. This year, we're excited to partner with our friends at the Atlanta Regional Council. My name is Nielle Juris. I'm the Director of Communications and Engagement, and my team and I have the distinct pleasure of planning today's session. When I think of social equity, I think of the underlying systemic difference of opportunity. The situation in which individuals within our society have the same status, including equal access to social goods and services, housing, transportation, education, civil rights, justice, and more. The deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, coupled with the disproportionate deaths of Black and Brown children, families related to the COVID-19 virus, have cast an even brighter light on racism. Today, we have an esteemed panel with us to share how they're working to incorporate equity in their industries to help eliminate systemic racism. We're equally thrilled to have our moderator, Nina Brooks from The Ohio State University, to help facilitate this conversation. But before we get started, I want to share a couple of housekeeping rules with our attendees. If you're attending and not presenting, please make sure you're on mute. If you're on phone, that is *6. And to unmute, you would do *6 again. If you are tuning in with your camera, please make sure that's off. We want to make sure that our presenters have the opportunity to talk and speak. If you have a question, we're going to ask you to put it in the chat. And at the end, we hope to have enough time to answer those questions. We encourage you to join the conversation on social media by using the hashtag MORPC, M-O-R-P-C, ARC, Summit, and we'll put that in the chat for everyone. So definitely share with your friends that you are joining this summit and you're participating in this panel. And so finally, professional credits are available through American Planning Association, AIA. For our engineers, it's self-reporting, but we can provide a certificate if you need to have one. So today our moderator is Nina Brooks. She is a diversity inclusion consultant and member of the HR executive leadership team from The Ohio State University. Prior to joining The Ohio State University, Nina had an extensive background in the banking industry in HR operations, diversity strategy, and program development. Additionally, Nina chairs the Black Employee Resource Council of Central Ohio, a council she created 3 years ago to strengthen employee resource groups within organizations. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to our moderator, Nina Brooks.
Thank you, Nielle. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here, excited to join all of our panelists and to really kind of get into this conversation around social equity. I want to make sure we understand the theme for this panel. We're going to be talking about social equity, the pillars of social equity, how we are overcoming racial disparities to build a more sustainable future. This session is designed to address incorporating social equity in our bodies of work. Many of our local governments, private and public sectors are besieged with how the term translates regarding how to achieve equitable and sustainable regions for all. This workshop will provide some valuable context to that. This panel will discuss how social determinants may contribute to the disparities and inequities among minorities, and even with the COVID-19 crisis that has heightened to national awareness. Now, I want to quote Charles Darwin, who famously remarked in the 19th century, "If the misery of the poor because not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." So we're going to get started with having our panelists introduce themselves, because I won't be able to give them all the credit. So I'm going to start with Stephanie. Stephanie, we'll go with you to introduce yourself.
Good morning. Thank you to MORPC for this opportunity to be here at the 2020 Summit on Sustainability. And this theme around sustainability is really important as we are in this moment in time as it relates to uncovering the inequities. COVID has definitely taken unmasked those inequities that have existed for years in our country. I am just really excited that we are continuing as a community to have these kind of conversations, to be able to make sure that all of us have to begin to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, so that we can really begin to achieve the kind of sustainability that's going to be needed in order for us to deal with the issues of equality versus equity. As the president and CEO of Columbus Urban League, I have been really not training, but I have been for 10 years really working toward this moment where we have an opportunity to talk about those social injustices and racial inequalities that exist in our community. The Columbus Urban League was built on the foundation that we will empower communities and change lives for African American people and those who are marginalized. And so for 102 years, the Columbus Urban League has been here in this community trying to do that. The Urban League movement began after Jim Crow South and what people saw as a great migration to the north, so that they could escape the Jim Crow South. And when the black people came north, they went up the west coast and went up the east coast. They were looking for better housing. They were looking for better jobs. They were looking for better health care. They were looking for the ability to get greater and better education. And what's unfortunate is that here we are 100 years later, and we are still striving and fighting for better jobs, for better health care, for better quality education, and for stable and affordable housing. And so really what I have come to believe as we have gone through the last 6 or 7 months, dealing with the social injustices and all of these social determinants and disparities that exist.
Hey, Stephanie, can I interrupt you for a few minutes? You are sounding a little muffled. It's kind of hard for us to hear. Are you on your AirPods?
No, I'm not. Which is no. I'm not.
Maybe turn your camera.
It might be. Can you mute Nina and then see what happens?
Okay.
Is that better now? No. Okay. Why don't we do this? Why don't you go to Ed and let me reboot and get back on?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I'm gonna log out. So I'll log out and you go ahead to the next person.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Ed, thank you. You want to go next?
Absolutely. I am not the best stand-in for President Hightower, but I will do my best and give her some time to get back in here because I know what she has to say is so important. But to that point, I'm Edward Johnson. I'm the Director of Public Health Policy at Columbus Public Health, which is the local health department for the second largest city in the Midwestern United States. So on behalf of Dr. Mashika Roberts and my 500 colleagues, wanted to say thank you for having us here. We're very excited to be here to have this discussion and to participate in this during the midst of what I think we can safely say is the largest public health crisis in the last 100 years. To that point, the COVID pandemic has really revealed a lot of things that I think if you're participating in this call, you kind of may have already known, you may have already had a sense of, which is, that racism is a public health crisis, that a lot of these social determinants seem to disproportionately affect Black and brown folks throughout our community. And so that's something that we've really been looking at. Back on February 13th of this year, in a different world and in a different time, Mayor Andrew Ginther at his State of the City said, he declared that in the city of Columbus, racism is a public health issue and it is a public health crisis. And so we've put together the Center for Public Health Innovation here to look at policies and programs and how to address that and how to make sure that folks can attain their full health potential, regardless of where they come from, what their circumstances are, or what their background or their race is. And so we're incredibly excited to be here to participate in this discussion.
Thank you, Edward, and welcome. I'll go with Kyle Strickland next, our next panelist.
Oops. Hey, everybody. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. First off, thank you, Nina, and thank you, Neil, and the entire MORPC team for putting this together, the Summit on Sustainability. I have the pleasure of working at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, as well as serve on MORPC's Regional Public Policy Roundtable. So very familiar with the work that's done here. You know, when I think about equity, when I think about these issues, as our panelists, our esteemed panelists have discussed, this is a once in a lifetime moment that we're facing. But at the same time, it is also a fact that we have underlying disparities that have been left unaddressed for too long. And so at the Kirwan Institute, what I think about when we look at the issue of social equity, we really lean into the issue of racial equity and talk about the disparities that persist. And we do this through two lenses. The first is through race and cognition. That's kind of the implicit bias, those types of individual level actions and even explicit biases that people hold on the individual level. Those are things that a lot of people can identify. A lot of people can talk about. They know how to explain what that type of individual level racism or problem is. But the other lens is something that I think hasn't been discussed enough. And thankfully, now the conversation is starting, which is on structural racism and looking at the systemic factors that continue to perpetuate inequality. So that looks at our laws, our policy, and our country's history and how it influences these disparities. Because here's the thing, at the end of the day, the inequality, the despair that we see in our country, the disparities that we see, the massive racial disparities that we see in every single economic, socio indicator is the result of systemic policies that have been built on extraction and exploitation of people. And the reason that's important is because some people might see the challenges that we face as some sort of personal responsibility issue or some sort of skills deficit. But instead, we need to actually flip the conversation, and the framing is not about individuals and individual level behavior, but rather structures and systems. Of course, personal responsibility always plays a role in things, but it does not impact on the vast scope and scale that we see that structures play a role. So one of the things that I want all of us to really be thinking about is how do we move systems? How do we change policies to address disparities that address the underlying issues rather than just expecting this to be an individual level solution to societal deep challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Kyle. Thank you for that. Let's go back to Stephanie and see if we can pick up where she left off. Steph?
Nina, you know I'm old, so I don't remember where I left off. Is that good now? I don't know where I left off.
That is good. If you can start with just talking about the work you guys do and the history of the Urban League.
Sure. So, you know, our work is really centered around those pillars that I talked about earlier. It's about workforce development, jobs, careers. It's about how do we bring about housing stabilization. It's about wealth building for the Columbus Urban League. It's about quality education, and especially we're really concerned about early childhood education. And then there are special populations of people that we deal with, especially those restored citizens. And then last, small business development is really key because we know that small businesses are the backbone of this country, but we also know that Black-owned businesses have also been, they've been inequitable as it relates to access to capital and for their growth. So those are the things at the Columbus Urban League that we have the privilege of being able to work on a daily basis. And again, after 102 years, it's really unfortunate that we are continuing to have to deal with a lot of these issues. And I believe the reason why the Columbus Urban League has not really been able to reach its full potential is because we represent the stains of slavery. Mm-hmm. And so it has been easier to just continue to sweep those stains under the rug and act as if they didn't exist. And so it goes and speaks to what Kyle Strickland was talking about, those systemic structures and systems that exist that continue to allow for the inequities and disparities in our country to be prolonged and unaddressed.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was great. And we also have Odetta McLeish-White joining us as a panelist. Odetta, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Hopefully I sound okay. Sound check, sound check.
You sound great.
Okay, good. And Stephanie sounds great now too. I kind of just want to sit and listen. Already the folks in Columbus are ready to bring the fire today. So I bring you greetings from Atlanta. Everyone, thank you so much for this invitation. You're probably going, what is she doing on this panel? The Transformation Alliance is a collaborative that works very closely with the Atlanta Regional Commission. Although I myself am not a planner by training or by experience, I have been embedded within the Atlanta Regional Commission structure for the past 3 years and work very closely with the Community Development Group of the Atlanta Regional Commission, which also works very closely with MORPC. And so I think when they were thinking about perhaps offering another perspective into this conversation, I'm really grateful that they thought of the Atlanta Regional Commission and Transformation Alliance. We are Transformation Alliance, of which I'm the managing director, is a 35-member organization. We're a collaborative. We are not a formal 501c3. We are a group of organizations that have seen fit to keep working together for the past 6 years now. And what has really helped hold us in place as a cross-sector and intersectional diverse group of professionals and neighbors is our two kind of North Stars. The first being the centrality of addressing race and racism in why our transit system acts the way it does, but also the central importance of transit to access to opportunity. So we are on the hunt for equitable transit-oriented development, which means we take a very holistic approach. We believe equity means understanding the specific needs of a neighborhood and crafting solutions and partnership that reflects those specific needs. And we're also very aware that race is sort of the core driver of the disparities we see in transit access, in life expectancy, in climate resilience and impact, and in health and jobs access. So we want to get to the root of the root together and take the journeys necessary to be better leaders and partners on those areas. And I can certainly speak more as we get into our questions, but thank you so much for having me this morning.
No, thank you, and welcome again. Audience, so as you can see, we have a very illustrious panel, and I'm excited to kind of get into the conversation about social equity. Now, this first question that I want to kick off to our panel is really about the definition or the difference between equality and equity, which are often used interchangeably. However, they're not one and the same. Let's talk about how they differ in different ways or numerous ways. How would you explain the difference, Stephanie?
Thank you. So I hope I'm still doing well as far as being able to be heard. Great. So, you know, I'm going to use the analogy when we start talking about early childhood education. We know that Black and Brown children, usually, especially those who come from generational poverty, they are usually not starting school at the same level as their white counterparts in the suburban community who come up in the suburban communities. There are not books in the homes. A lot of times, a lot of their parents may or may not have the equivalent of in high school education. We have those people who are probably not working. And so their language skills and their exposure skills are different from those individuals who are in more affluent households or from a different socioeconomic background. And so when we talk about equal and equitable education, we have to realize that those babies who come from those urban neighborhoods or from generational poverty, they're going to need a little bit more access to assistance and resources in order to get them to kindergarten and making sure that they are on a level playing field. And so, but so many times what we have done in this country, because of the different structures and systemic racism that exist, we put those babies in the kindergarten classes They do not know how to hold up a book. They do not have people are able to read to them on a daily basis. And then they start down this track or trajectory through the school system, needing those additional resources. And unfortunately, they're not given those additional resources, because if the formula says that we're only going to pay $12,000 a year per child to teach them, there's this thought that across the board, all of those children will get the $12,000 worth of resources. But we know that those kids who come from those lower socioeconomic groups and generational poverty really needed to have $16,000 a year in order for them to then get caught up and to be on a level playing field with those other children who came in with more resources and exposure prior to getting to kindergarten.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And we still kind of see the impacts of not having those resources for earlier education. Edward, what about you? How would you kind of explain the difference between equality and equity?
Absolutely. So from a health perspective and from a public health perspective, I think when folks talk about equity and equality, it kind of comes down to access to care. How are folks accessing care, and do they have it? And so from an equality perspective, someone might say, well, we have the Affordable Care Act that's in place, so you can pay for it and go make an appointment and go see this doctor and go here and go there, without this recognition that for certain communities, for the African American community, there may be a fundamental distrust of the medical profession that's well earned for a variety of reasons. When we talk about some of the issues that maybe COVID vaccine trialists are having, not recruiting enough African Americans, that's because there is a history of experimenting on African Americans. And so there's this natural baked in distrust of saying, you want to use me for a medical trial? Even if you're not doing those things that you did in the past, there has to be that recognition that you need to do a little bit extra to bring folks to the table, to bring them to the starting line. And so that's what we tend to talk about. If you look here in Columbus at our community testing program for COVID-19, if you look at where the sites are, where the clinics are in the community, you may notice, yes, we're giving special focus and special attention to our Black and Brown communities, because we're seeing a disparate impact of COVID-19 on those communities, and we need to ensure that access to testing is there. So that's a big part of what we see there in terms of bringing up baseline, but it even goes even further. How are we setting the baseline of our community's health? We can look at things that tie into education, as Stephanie was saying. For us in public health, we're very concerned about lead-burdened houses. We know that children who have lead poisoning tend to have a lot of behavioral issues. They come across as hyperactive. Folks say they don't listen. When it's time to focus, they're very lethargic, and they just can't get them to engage in the learning that needs to be done to bring them up to level with some of their peers. Well, those are all symptoms of lead poisoning. And here in Columbus, we know that African Americans are more likely to live where there's older housing stock. Older housing stock was more likely still lead burdened. And so that's another challenge that we have, to say a lot of our majority population live in newer housing that wasn't built with lead paint in it. So we don't need to give this specific focus to those communities, but we do need to give that specific focus to our older communities, where we are finding our African American and Hispanic Latino community living as well. And so that's where we start to say that is where we're focusing our resources, because public health is about the baseline health of our entire community. And if we have these groups that are lagging behind specifically and almost as an entire group, then that's where our attention should be focused, because they are the most in need. And so in public health, that's how we define the difference between equality of access and equity of access to health.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Odetta, what about you? How would you contribute to that question?
Sure, I'll use a data point that I talk about quite often. So if you want, equality is the idea that there is a MARTA. MARTA is our transit agency here in Atlanta, our heavy rail and bus system. MARTA has a transit stop in Oakland City, which is a neighborhood of Atlanta that is predominantly African American, legacy neighborhood. So decades and generations of Black families live there, but an average, a median income of about $28,000 a year. There's also a transit station in Buckhead, which is the predominantly white, very wealthy area of Atlanta. But between these two transit sites, there's a 10-year life expectancy difference. according to the Robert Wood Foundation, you have a 72-year life expectancy if you live near the Oakland City MARTA station, and an 82-year life expectancy if you live near the Buckhead station. So that's it right there. To me, equality is, we can say we both have a thing, but equity will address how that thing serves you and brings improvement to your life, quality to your life, and how does that thing reflect how others perceive your value, right? The equity question is about how others and the system around you perceives your worth. And so everyone is perceived as being of equal worth, we're going to have inequity, as folks could put two stations, but the sidewalks in the Oakland City station, there are small neighborhoods within that neighborhood that have no streets in 20 sidewalks and no paved streets in 2020. We have, tremendous, so lighting issues, food access, they all kind of layer up around this MARTA station versus Buckhead, which is of course replete with green space, well-lit sidewalks, lots of different shops and food access, et cetera. So, and I never present that number without reminding folks that, 10 years is a number, but inside that 10 years is birthdays, reunions, grandchildren you may or may not know, aunts and uncles who won't know their nieces and nephews. That's a lot to be denied. There's a lot of life to be denied based on where you live. So that I think reflects equality versus inequity. Yeah, equality, equalness versus equity.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So Kyle, let me also pose this question to you as it relates to the research and the work you do around just the criminal justice work.
Yeah, so of course, and first off, this is all great points on the equity equality. It's hard to follow those acts, but it's exactly right. Those are the ways we look at it in context. So kind of on a baseline, we look at equality as kind of mentioned here, kind of everybody getting the exact same level of support. So they're just getting the exact same treatment as everybody else, regardless of circumstance. And that's equality, right? The idea from that is, well, everybody's treated fairly. They're given the same supports. And so they're all good to go. However, without further context, you realize that those same supports mean that not everybody's going to benefit in the same way as those supports are given. So as a result, more support is needed to be given for those who are depending on their need and depending on their circumstance. So that's where equity comes in. It's really about, this is about providing the level of supports that folks need based on circumstance, right? Based on level of need. So when it comes to, for example, benefits, government benefits. So it's providing more opportunities and more resources based on financial need. So the greater financial need you have, the more support theoretically that you should get. So that's equity. But I would take that even a step further. And really, a lot of this space is have the conversation about justice, right? So not just equity, but justice, which is not only are we going to provide more supports based on those who are in need, but we're also going to tackle the root causes of those barriers that created those issues in the first place. And the reason why this is important is because narrative is key here. The facts are that our social welfare programs have been, there has been a narrative that certain people, especially Black and brown people, are undeserving of this type of welfare support, and that you don't need government handouts for people, not recognizing the exploitation that others have alluded to, that have been perpetuated by our government, by private actors over time, and continues to perpetuate today. So we have to move into that mindset of justice. So another example, when we look at the criminal justice system, you look at the way in which we see disparate treatment in every single domain. So when it comes to, let's say that there are similar rates of drug usage from Blacks and whites, for example, that there are more likely Blacks are more likely at 3 to 4 times rates to get arrested than their white counterparts, more likely to be incarcerated and sentenced longer. All these disparities can continue to persist all the way down the line. When we talk about the steps for criminal justice reform, when we say that we are going to, for example, more steps that are made to decriminalize or to legalize marijuana, for example, and then if you don't do anything about all of the people who have a record because of those very same crimes, then you're not addressing the underlying disparities. So there's so much that we have to do, not just to be about equality, but also to be about equity and justice. Because what happens is there's a narrative that says people are undeserving because they need more and they're getting more, they're taking away from my benefits because of their own individual level problems. And what that narrative does is it completely erases the fact that there are barriers that make it harder for people to achieve true equity and ultimately the equality that we want to see.
Yeah, thank you. And all of the points you brought up in terms of how different equity and equality are great points. And we know this continues to be crucial conversations that many of our public and private sectors are having today. But how do we get to a point where organizations aren't just putting it on the shelf or doing something very minimal to just check the box, to just say that they're kind of making some effort towards resolution and equality? So how do we get organizations to not just check the box, but really incorporate them in their policies and really work on the barriers to that systemic racism that exists?
So I'll just go ahead and I'll start to say, look, I believe that, you know, this again, am I bad again?
Well, you got like some whistling, like a horn or something going on.
I am so sorry. Go ahead, Kyle, you go.
Yeah, I can take this one, Stephanie, but I want to hear Stephanie because she's going to speak some truth to power here on how we do this. So the first thing is we need accountability. I mean, point blank, there needs to be accountability. The facts are that whenever these types of situations happen, there's always this conversation that we're going to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and we're going to do this thing. We're going to put out a statement of support or something like that. But then you check back and you say, what happened? And you see that without accountability mechanisms in place, there's no incentive for people to actually change. And so we have to actually put in accountability structures. And you can't just throw the diversity and inclusion task onto the one Black person or somebody else to take the work on. You cannot just do that alone. And then you especially cannot say that, hey, I know your full-time role is something else, but I'm going to add on some diversity initiatives that you can lead. Go ahead and hire somebody that their full-time job is that diversity and inclusion. But more so than that, the accountability means that their voices and policies need to actually be taken into account. If you are talking about these issues and you have not changed your policies, any of your policies, then you are not meeting the needs that you need to step. So you need to look at accountability, which requires policy change. And you also need folks to be willing to have the difficult, hard conversations so that it's not only just a few employees, but it's at the leadership level and it's everybody else who is empowered to make decisions and to make changes happen. Because otherwise, what will happen undoubtedly is people are going to say, we're committed to this change. We're going to do something about diversity and inclusion, and nothing changes because people don't want to be held accountable. And the only types of hard conversations happen behind the scenes. And so sometimes that's going to require broader level coalitions and partnerships, other organizations to be transparent, to be open, to say, this is what we're doing, and we expect you to step up as well, because right now we are not getting there. And here's a hard point that a lot of folks also need to recognize. The work that they do, day to day is not separate from racial equity work. So for example, do not tell me that you're committed to racial equity and inclusion, and yet on the other hand, you're advocating for policies that continue to exploit and marginalize Black and brown people. And especially, this is a conversation we really need to have in the private sector. There are actions that happen that are problematic, and we've got to just have an honest conversation about that. And so there's so much that we have to do to make sure that we're doing all that we can to actually make sure that our actions match our words, because oftentimes they don't.
So I hope this is better now. So, just to build on what Kyle just talked about, we need for folks to have measurable outcomes put in place, but that comes from the top down. It just can't be, as Kyle mentioned, that you have the HR person or your D&I person that then is calling the shots and saying, this is what we need to do. your leadership needs to be able to make those kinds of statements and then make sure that there are measurable outcomes that are put in place. Things that are tied to compensation for those individuals who are responsible. Putting numbers, putting real data points in place and numbers for that folks have to achieve. And so when you start putting those kind of measurable pieces in place, then you know that it's sustainable. And it should be, you know, a 3, a 5, a 10, a 15-year plan. That if right now you have 5% Black people that are in your HR department, you need to make sure that by, you know, 2025, there's going to be at least, you know, another 5% that are in there. But folks have to put those kind of measurable outcomes in place. When you look at supplier diversity, you look at your spend, you know, how many of the, if you look at the percentage of your spend for goods and services, if you right now only have 1% Black, then your goal should be, is it 25% by a certain date? So I think when you start putting those measurable outcomes in place and making sure that you are holding people accountable, as Kyle said, and if their jobs and their compensation is tied to it, then that's how you can make sustainable changes in the organizations. But it has to come from the top down.
Nina, you're on mute.
My apologies. Odetta, what about you? We'll have you weigh into that question.
Sure. Like all of that, and probably whatever Edward's about to say, right?
Right.
And I agree that at some point the leadership needs to get on board and direct, but oftentimes they are behind the staff or others in making the shifts, right? And I think one of the things I'm observing, even within the Atlanta Regional Commission, some of the younger people, Black, white, Asian, the new professionals, want to see their workplace align better with their personal values. And when those personal values are more about understanding equity and justice, they get very agitated and dissatisfied with when they don't see the leadership making clearer statements and taking clearer steps towards those things. And so we've been having kind of a discussion about the inside game, outside game moment, and some real strategic discussions that sometimes it takes a courage from the staff and from younger folks to foment something that allows the leader of the agency to go to the board, right? And say, we have to make these policy changes. People, you know, we are a workplace that, you know, respects certain things, and I got to manage these people and they're getting, you know, so that's one thing. It's like, you know, let those book clubs happen. Let people bring that sense of, you know, questioning, deep questioning to their workplace. I think that as we do that, and as we continue to explore, we also need to normalize discussing really the kind of oppressive and white supremacist roots of what we think a professional space looks like, what we think professional conversation should be, what we think a successful measure or program is. A lot of times those, if you keep digging at the root of why do we think that's that? Why do we say that's good versus that's bad? Why do we say that's high quality and that's not, you know, trustable information? It's because it's rooted in a sense of somebody else is saying we need to, we want to hold power. And so we're going to, this is the way an agenda should look, and this is the way a workplace should look. When we start to question those things, then the space can breathe and include deeper questions about justice, and folks can bring all of that. And then the last thing I'll say is, I've been really heartened to see some of the younger planning professionals really look at programs. And again, through the Atlanta Regional Commission, there are supportive programs like community development partnerships and livable communities initiatives that partner with cities, with their community development departments, to execute programs and studies. And there's been a real discussion to embed within the selection process of these cities to participate in the program more metrics that get towards equity, right? So if you have a resource of money or in-kind help to offer to a city planning department, and you want to do an application,
we are just having a lot of fun with technology this morning. So Edward, why
figure out who that cohort will be for this year or that year. Think of
Absolutely. So there's not much that I can add on to what everyone else has said in the immediate term, but there is one thing that I want to put out there, and I want to say, put a pin in this and take a note, because this has happened before and it might happen again. In times of crisis, you see a lot of Black and brown folks, and you see a lot of women hired to executive leadership. There's a crisis, we're taking a lot of heat. We need to bring on someone who can be a great face of the organization and really right us and put us in the right direction. I know that this has happened maybe locally, but I'm not going to speak about that because I need to maintain good relationships. But what you will say is they right the ship and they get things moving the right way and they clean up the house. And then the board of directors looks at them and says, you're just not a great culture fit. You know, you're really riling a lot of feathers. You're doing all of these things. And, you know, thank you for getting our primary line of business up and running again and profitable and sector leading, world beating. We really love that. But, you know, you're just not quite the thing, you know, I don't know, the other C-suite folks, they're just not quite getting along with you. And so, you know, the board of directors, they're just not happy that, you know, you're doing it this way. Can't you do it like this, like our company culture fit would tell you to do it? So thank you for your service. Here's a lovely severance package. We'll see you later. Thank you. We're very indebted to you. My fear is that all of the attention that we've given to racial justice and racial equity, you will see a lot of Black and brown folks hired into very high positions, and they will do very well. But for some reason, for one reason or another, they're not a culture fit, or the little peccadillos or the little sins that another person might just completely cruise over become a giant hurdle and a stumbling block and a reason for them to be shown the door. That's something that I think we need to watch in 6 months' time, in a year's time, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. Because we tend to go where leadership will take us. And if they only let you lead, but for so long, and then they say, we want a leader like the one before the last one. You know what that's going to look like, and you know what that's going to do. And they're going to say, that new program, I don't really like that. That makes me do things that I don't know. I don't want it to be my thing. I'm tired of having to integrate this diversity and inclusion program company-wide. Let's just hire someone else, make a new C-suite position, always the most junior one, and it's them. And they'll figure it out. Maybe. Sometimes we'll invite them to the C-suite meeting, sometimes we won't. So that's what, I don't want to add anything on the immediate sense, but I just want to say, take that note and put a pin in that, because it will happen in some places. And part of our charge is going to be to sustain this and to ensure that we support those leaders that are put in place because they are doing the right thing. They are being called to right the ship, and they will do it, but they're going to need our support to stay in those positions to maintain the ship.
Absolutely. That's great, Edward. I'm going to pause for a minute and see if the audience has any questions for Stephanie before she leaves us. So I'll pause to see if the audience has any questions for Stephanie, and then we'll go back to some questions.
They cleared me, Nina, a little bit, so I'm okay. They cleared me out.
Okay. I do want to kind of speak to a comment that was in the chat from Colby. Colby, thank you for adding this comment. The quantifiable and qualitative outcomes should be interwoven with the organization's missions, values, and visions and strategic framework in order to hold leadership accountable. In addition, he writes, those efforts should be measured through evaluation processes, whether merit, performance, or impact-based outcomes. All of those things true. And most organizations will react to a particular crisis or a particular issue and begin to put people in place, as Edward has mentioned, or begin to kind of put out a statement, but not really tying it to the value. If your values doesn't really speak to inclusion and diversity, you know, all of these other efforts aren't really resonating with anyone else. So great point, Kobe. Thank you for that. All right, so let's get into another question. How are you guys doing, panel? You guys good? All right, so we'll start this question out with Stephanie. And Stephanie, this question talks about some inequities and racial disparities have increased the risk of COVID-19 amongst ethnic minority groups. How do we focus on meeting the needs of those in our region to provide sustainability and equity to all?
What was the last part, Nina?
So how do we focus on meeting the needs of those in our region to provide sustainability and equity for all? Since we know that, go ahead.
Yeah, so, right now what we have to do is we have to make sure that we put more resources in place, as we've been talking about. But more importantly, this is a sore point for a lot of people in this community that I've been talking about. What we've got to stop doing in this community is putting, saying that I 50% or 80% of the people I serve are minorities. But what's not happening is we're not disaggregating the data.
Mm-hmm.
And so minorities can be women, minorities can be other, groups of people, and so what we've got to do is, what I'm asking everybody to do from a sustainability standpoint, to really look at these disparities among Black people and Latina people, is we have to disaggregate the data. We have to put programs in place like what President Pro Tem Elizabeth Brown, the legislation she put in the other day, Right for Recovery legislation, which basically we will be working with Catholic Social Services and the Lady of Guadalupe to look at those individuals who, as we know, are low-income workers who are being impacted by COVID, who are continuing to not get tested because they're afraid that they will lose their jobs or they cannot afford to go 2 weeks in quarantine without pay. And so what we will be doing is, they have put aside about $1.1 million in CARES Act money to be able to pay these people's wages for 2 weeks so that they can feel comfortable that they're not going to lose their job if they get sick, or that they won't not have any income stream coming in. And when you are 150% or 200% below the poverty level, making $15 or less, what you're not going to do is, a lot of people are afraid to go test. So it's those kinds of programmatic efforts that are intentional that we have to look at for Black and brown people. We know that Black people are the last ones hired and the first ones fired. They are mostly the first responders through this pandemic that are out there working on a day-to-day basis and have a higher chance of being impacted or infected with COVID. And so how do we put those kind of protective measures in place? So as I said, you shouldn't go broke because you got sick, right? You shouldn't go broke because you got sick. So we have to look at, again, when you start talking about those equities versus inequalities, those are the kinds of things we're talking about. Those people won't have the ability, and I was just joking with Ed earlier, with going to the hospital like former Governor Christie and that person in the White House and his family, and get that Reduteron or whatever the name of that drug is. We're not gonna get that. Those people, we're not gonna, or the steroids, we're not gonna get that, right? We're not gonna have 24-hour care, doctors coming in 5 times a day to check you out. When you're Black and you're poor, you're brown and you're poor, you're gonna hope that you can get into a hospital bed because you probably don't have the kind of insurance that you need. Mm-hmm. And so we have to find, as a community, how do we put in our leaders like Council Member Brown, put more in City Council, put more of those kind of, and I'm not gonna say, I don't like to say safety nets, but we need to put in programs so that it doesn't continue to make the disparities and those racial inequities even greater than what they already are.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. So Edward, let me hear from you in terms of public health policy to that question.
Okay, public health and COVID, how did that happen? When we speak to how this has increased risk, just a quick data level set here. African Americans are more than twice as likely to be carrying the burden of COVID here in our local community. Our Hispanic and Latino community is 5 times as likely from our non-Hispanic white community to be carrying the burden of COVID. And then when we get to hospitalization, Black folks are hospitalized more than 2.5 times more than white folks. Hispanic Latinos are hospitalized 3.5 times more than non-Hispanic whites in our own local community. This is here in Columbus. These aren't national statistics. They aren't up in the air. This is what's happening here. And so we have to start looking at the policies and looking at what is this where is this coming from? How is this being caused? Really simply, I put it back to some really basic statistics. We know that smoking and tobacco usage are a risk factor that can put you in the hospital and put you in an ICU if you contract COVID-19. Here in Columbus and Franklin County, there are 160,000 smokers and tobacco users. 100,000 of them are African American. 100,000 out of 160,000. And of that number, about 70,000 use menthol flavored tobacco products. If you look at where the advertising is here, the physical advertising for these products, they are in predominantly African American neighborhoods. This is not an accident. This didn't just happen because of natural preferences playing themselves out over time. This was intentional and it was targeted. And so what are we going to do about that? Do we want to implement policies that say, hey, this targeted marketing, menthol cigarette, menthol tobacco advertising close to schools that are predominantly African American, that has to end? That's an option. That's something we could do. We could make it harder to obtain these products because we know of the disproportionate impact that it's having on our Black and brown communities, because it is landing them in the hospital and it is landing them in the ICU. I don't have the freshest data, but I know a couple weeks ago, I took a look at who was ending up in the intensive care unit. The average individual was a Black female in their 40s. That's who was landing in the ICUs here in Columbus. So we know that COVID-19 is revealing these health disparities and it's putting them on steroids, so that we're finally realizing, my goodness, the baseline for these communities is not where it is for our majority community here in Columbus. And so that's how we need to start looking at it. That's why we're saying racism is a public health crisis. We all kind of sensed it, and now we know it. Our Black and brown folks have a shorter life expectancy. And when you look at quality of life in terms of healthcare and things like that, it is lower. As we've started to say that, I haven't found one person who's disagreed with me. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, when I say that, no one says like, no, I don't think that's right. That doesn't sound appropriate. Everyone says like, you're probably right. That probably sounds like it's true. I'm like, it is. We have the data to support that. So those are the disparities that we're seeing. And we have to, as a community, make that choice to say, we need to act. Yes, it's something that I like, or yes, it's something that I may think unconsciously choosing, but I've also been the victim of a lifetime of targeted marketing and free access to it, which was not appropriate, which was not done for other communities.
Absolutely, and we are running out of time, so I'm going to hear from Kyle real quick and then Odetta on this question, and then we'll move to one audience question before we wrap up.
Of course. So thank you so much. Well, Edward, I'd say probably sadly, there's a few state legislators and folks at the federal level that might disagree, sadly. But the broader, exactly. But the broader point remains, right? Which is, how do we address these issues? And I think especially as Stephanie put it, you have this first fired, last hired type of thing, which we know that the result of COVID-19, not only the health disparities in that crisis, but also the economic disparities that come with it, means that we are going to see a situation in which Black and brown folks are going to take longer to recover, both on the health end, but also on the economic end than others. And so as a result, we need to make sure that our policies are transformative. We have to have big structural changes to our policies here, because at the end of the day, if we continue to just tinker around the edges, we are not going to solve the crises that we face. And so, for example, the economic recession that we are in the midst of, right? You like to hear the president talks often about the stock numbers and the stock market and things like that, when everyday people on Main Street and everyday people are struggling because they are not recovering as fast as those at the very top, or who had wealth to protect them in the first place. So this is also a conversation about wealth and about access, those other protective factors that protect certain people and have not historically been provided for Black and brown communities. So we need to be talking about things like bold social safety nets, so that if people get sick, they don't lose access to their job opportunities. We also know disproportionately the essential workers are Black and Latinx folks. And then we also know that even as COVID rates increase and things open up in our society, those who are going to be most proximate to other people are Black and Latinx folks. And we continue to see this. And so you are not only exposed at greater risk, but you also have less protections when you do contract the virus. And then if you have, you're worrying about your health care and you're having to worry about your financial circumstances, That's a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
The COVID relief packages and the care packages, we need more support for folks, and we didn't provide that enough, nearly enough. We have to do that again.
Yeah, that's great. I like what you said about bold social nets. That's a great point that we need. Odetta, I'll finish up with you, and then we'll go to this question from the audience.
Sure. How's my sound? Did it come back?
Yes, it did.
Okay, great. I'll just say this real quick so we can get to the next question. I think we have to think very carefully about places of trust if we are trying to bring resources or do testing, or we want to ask communities who have been taught not to trust systems. All right, they're not dumb. They know why they should not trust certain systems, or a lot of them. Then we need to find the places that they trust and take things there and invert the burden of access away from you come figure out this system. We serve people who don't care whether you thrive or not, and turn it into a system that goes where trust already exists. So super quick example here in Atlanta, we just did some lane closures, pilot lane closures with cones to kind of let people ride their bikes in community and just check out what it would be like to maybe skinny up a road a little bit. And we brought free walk-up COVID testing, right? And we brought some bags of groceries, and we brought some voter registration material. We brought it to them in their community. They didn't have to find childcare, figure out how to bring kids to some place, worry about money, or, like just bring where people have created spaces of trust, what you want them to partner with you on, and with great respect, ask them to engage with you.
Great. Thank you, Odetta. So let's go to this question from the audience. And I'll start with Stephanie for you to kind of lead with this answer. What does social and environmental reconciliation look like to you, all in your respective places that you operate in? And do you all think or believe the process starts with truth-telling instead of listening to facts to initiate social justice?
So first, as you can see, the digital divide is alive and well. I live in the neighborhood, and so I cannot get this Wi-Fi to connect. So when you start talking about those environmental issues, then this is real in all seriousness. When you don't have access to internet and kids are trying to learn remotely from school, it puts those Black and brown children at a disadvantage. And so why isn't internet now a utility that everybody has access to? And so we do know that the digital divide is alive and well. What was the last part of that, Nina? That question?
So do you think or believe the process starts with truth-telling instead of listening to facts to initiate social justice conversation and discourse?
And just to answer that part of the question, or to answer that part, it's this. We as a community, and white folks as well as Black folks, we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to be willing to have conversations that we normally have not been able to have or we're afraid to have. So being comfortable, with being uncomfortable is how we begin to really address those social justice issues that exist in our community and in this country.
Great, thank you for that. And Edward, I'll have you kind of chime into that question, and then we'll move into the next one before we wrap up.
Absolutely. So as we talk about environment, I'm here at Columbus Public Health. We're a science-based organization. So when we talk about truth-telling and listening to facts, to me, they're synonyms. The facts are the truth. And so we have to make sure that we're maintaining a fidelity to that. When we talk about science, we think that that's really important. So initiating that is fantastic. Just a really super short history lesson. Public health's first major victory were sewers. So we think environmental change is really important. Most of the diseases that we don't hear about anymore because we had public health victories were related to the fact that people took human waste in a bucket and dumped it on the street. And public health was like, hey, this is like a really bad idea. We have got to keep people away from that stuff. And once we were able to separate them, a lot of diseases started to go away. And then we talked about vaccination. So listening to those facts leads you to telling that truth. And it is always a great idea to have facts to support that truth in brief.
Thank you. So let me just get to this question and then we will move on, but I do want to address, we did actually have a grad student from the Ohio State University asking this question, or making this statement and asking this question. She's been trying to push administration to change policies and practices to support our BIPOC students, and there are so many barriers in place to prevent that from actually happening. We've rallied support from a majority of the school and a lot of faculty, but are still facing pushback. It feels like a wall, not sure what to do. So I'll pose that question to you, Kyle, to start that off, answering that.
Of course, that's a great question, Victoria. I'm very familiar with the work that a lot of students are pushing and leading the efforts at Ohio State. There's a long history of students trying to push to make changes happen. Administration not always quick on getting there, but I think that's a necessary step. So for one, thank you. And then two, I'll put my email in the chat and we can talk about continuing to make those pushes happen, because I think, especially with the new president that is here at the university, I think there's an opportunity to really make sure that the words are actually matched with action, which goes into the kind of the broader point in discussion. Also, I see looks like Morpsey, Rolanda, of course, who helped put this together, is talking about the broadband access, right? So one, great job there. You know, one of the pieces here is, at the end of the day, we also have to be talking about what are the policies that are harming people, right? What policies are you putting forth that are actually harming people? That's the truth telling we need, because, you know, here's the thing. You know, I've been on, panel discussions with state legislators who are talking about infant mortality issues, right? Who are talking about all of the problems with infant mortality, and are talking about that we need to do something about it. And yet they end their panel and they go back to the state house and they vote on taking away people's health care and Medicaid. I mean, you know, all of these things are, you have to be like, let's speak truth to power here. Don't tell me one thing over here and then you're doing things that are harming our communities, the very communities that you claim to be serving. So, you know, those are the things that we just need to be doing more of, not just all of the things that we need to do, but what are the things you need to stop doing less of? How do you stop causing harm? That's important. We need to also be having those conversations.
Yeah, good point, good point. Odetta, did you want to contribute to that question before we tie this up?
It sounds very specific there, but I mean, I think we do need to start with truth telling. I think Edward made a great point about combining facts. You know, I think a lot of discussions advanced when we started overlaying maps of redlining with maps of poverty, with maps of access disparities of all kinds, and people started going, wait a minute. And so knowing that history better, that is, you know, we're not doing a great job sort of teaching the real history and roots, and this, the federal administration is actively working against exploring the real history of this country, which, you know, there's a lot of white fragility happening around that conversation. Like it is to tackle the history and discuss what has resulted from it and get up out of your feelings the way a lot of us have to get up out of our feelings every day to sort of navigate these systems so that you can talk about solution and change. So you need the truth telling, you need the facts, you need to learn to not get stuck in your lamentation as maybe a white person, or if you identify with the oppressor side of things, you know, you figure out what you can do to leverage and help and be an accomplice, right? And then I do think the OSU thing, just as interesting as I was talking about that inside game, you know, the inside foment that is sometimes really necessary to keep, you know, to match up with outside pressure. The world outside is changing. The young people coming into the system want to see a better match. And so they are continuing, as they always do, to stir things up and stir things up. And so what we need to do is eliminate the barriers that are keeping them from creating spaces where they can thrive.
Yes, thank you so much. And you guys have all provided such great insight and perspective. And I wish we had more time, but I did want to also mention to Victoria, to that question, Kyle mentioned being a resource. Feel free to reach out to me as well. I can definitely connect you to some resources to kind of help you kind of remove some of those barriers that you're facing. All right, so thank you again, panelists, for joining us and providing just a wealth of knowledge to our social equity discussion. We're going to turn it over to Niele, and she's going to finish us out.
Thank you, everyone. I want to give a warm welcome or round of applause to our moderator and to our esteemed panelists. Thank you for taking time to talk about this very important topic. And we want to let you know that, definitely this is something that can be an ongoing discussion. And if you're interested or had additional questions and we ran out of time, please feel free to email us at info@morpc.org, and we'll make sure to route those to our panelists. So we hope that you've learned something that will empower you to be a change agent, to take this information back to your organization. And so we realize there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and this is just the beginning. So again, thank you for joining us today. And if you want to continue the conversation, we are hosting our big table today at 1:30 p.m. to talk about environmental justice. And so yes, thank you, Bevan. He just put the link in the chat. So if you're interested in joining us, please feel free to copy that link or email us if you missed it at info@morpc.org, and we'll be sure to get that to you. So again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.